So we've talked about the big Canadian distilleries, but we can't not talk a bit about the small distillers in Canada, and there's tons and tons of them. So first off the bat, if you want to learn more, there's a great book. It's again by Davin DeCargamo and Blair Phillips called The Definitive Guide to Canadian Distilleries. And if you're wanting to explore, everything about Canadian whiskey, the book has pages on tons and tons of different distilleries. You can find distilleries near you if you live in Canada, or distilleries wherever you might be traveling if you're ever visiting Canada, and they're worth visiting. It's still a pretty new segment. Out in Nova Scotia, there is a distillery that's been around for quite some time, Glen Breton, and it's been producing single malt for a long time out east, and actually comes from a whole area where Gaelic is spoken, and it's very Scottish. And they have some good ties to some Scottish distilleries that go back decades. So they were kind of the first smaller distillery, and then there was kind of a long pause until the early 2000s, and you had some distilleries starting to pop up. Shelter Point, you had in Ontario, Stillwaters was the first in around I think 2012, and you had these distilleries start to pop up, and since then it's just boomed. So British Columbia is probably the hotbed of craft distilling in Canada. You have tons and tons of small distilleries out there. It's one of the better provinces to make whiskey in from a kind of rules and regulations perspective. So it's a place where small distilleries are really thriving. So first of all, if there's any in your area, go explore them. Usually you can get free tastings, taste their stuff. There's a lot of stuff they make that isn't whiskey. A lot of that stuff is worth trying. If you're into gin, there's just some really, really nice gins being made in Canada. The best gins in Canada are being made by small producers. And then all, wide array of sort of other spirits. On the whiskey side, because it's a bit young, there's been, it takes some time to make whiskey. A lot of the focus has been on young single malts, which have all been young because the distilleries are all young. And a lot of distilleries that really look a bit towards Scotland, which I don't always understand, because I think we have a really good distilling tradition here in Canada that's been well established and historical, that's unique, that we can spread. So why look to Scotland to compete with a category that does that so well and has been doing it so long? But not to say single malts aren't good. So there's a lot of the focus has been on single malts, but each distillery does its own thing. So worth trying. The one thing I would encourage you though is if you try their whiskey and you're like, oh, this is not, this is rough, this is raw, keep tracking with it. Some of the worst whiskey I've ever had has been young single malt, and I tasted the same whiskey 5 years later, and it was quite nice. So, you have to wait, especially with single malt. It takes time. So all that to say, try their spirits, try their whiskey. If you feel like the whiskey still isn't up to snuff, I wouldn't write them off. I would wait, and patience will be rewarded. And I found that to be true. Each of the small distilleries, other than maybe two brewers, it's taken a few years for them really to get the age up to a point where they're really making some really nice whiskey. So that's the other thing I would say. So beyond that, get Davin's book, read it if you're interested, go explore. You really have to see these things. But I did want to talk about a few just distilleries that I'd recommend that are doing some really good stuff. I've tasted as many as I can get a hold of, so I've tasted from over 40 small producers, maybe more, and a few ones that are just really notable off the bat. One is Last Mountain in Saskatchewan. They make a wheat whiskey that's just phenomenal. Pardon me. It's just phenomenal. It's the best portrayal of wheat I've seen in a whiskey. I've tasted quite a few wheat whiskeys. It's hard to get that right. They just do an awesome job with their wheat whiskey. They release single casks and some other stuff. So try their wheat whiskey. It's, one of the best examples you can find of a good wheat whiskey. So Last Mountain, there's a few other ones that have popped up with some really fun releases. Last Straw Distillery in Vaughan. They're quite experimental, so they're releasing all kinds of different stuff. They released a whiskey made from a stout mash. A stout beer that was unhopped, which was awesome. Really interesting. They've done some really interesting stuff with malted corn. Some of the rye has been good. They're still in the early stages, so they've had some that haven't hit the mark as much for me. But there's some stuff coming out of there that's really good. I that really excites me. You also have what else do I want to mention here? I think if I look at kind of my Odd Society Spirits, they do a bunch of stuff that isn't whiskey. They've had one or two whiskeys that have made me raise my eyebrows. So they're another fun one. And I guess I could just keep talking. Eau Claire is another one I want to mention. They make single malts. Their stuff is really, really promising. It's still, I think, in the early stages, but really, really, they make some really, really nice single malt. But in terms of my top 3 recommendations to try in Canada at the moment, because I still think there's 3 distilleries that still stand above the rest. There's a few others kind of looking in, and I've mentioned those already. Eau Claire is maybe one that's, poised to jump in. But Black Fox is another one in Saskatchewan. They make some Triticale whiskey, really interesting. So as you can tell, there's so much I could talk about here, but I have tasted a lot, and I do kind of know what my top 3 in Canada are. Now this is my opinion. People have different opinions, but 3 distilleries I would recommend trying from if you can. One is here in Ottawa, North of 7 Distillery. They, in the last 2-ish years, all their whiskeys have kind of come 5-6 years old, and they just make their casks that are coming out are just really, really nice. They take special time to roast their grains. They get their grains locally. They make their whiskey in a bit of an American style, so they're using a bunch of grains together in a mash bill, and they're maturing in new oak. And they make all kinds of different stuff. They make something in the style of a high rye bourbon. They make something in the style of a high wheat bourbon. They make a 4-grain whiskey that's still mostly corn, so it would be sort of in the style of a 4-grain bourbon. And then they also make a 95% rye and a single malt. So they make lots of stuff. They source their casks from the same companies that the best distillers in Kentucky do. So their casks are just awesome. And I'm pretty privileged because I live in Ottawa. I've also been able to, get a bunch of friends together and actually buy casks at cask strength from them. So that is a fun experience. That's another reason to go explore your local craft distilleries, because if you like their whiskey and you can buy a cask, just an awesome experience to taste a bunch of casks, pick your favorite, and get some bottles, often at a discounted price. So anyway, so they're a bit of an American style. I'll taste one of their whiskeys in the next video. But in terms of, if you like bourbon or a bit more of that, they do a really, really good job. And they're very grain forward in a way that's very nice. The quality of their grain's great, the quality of their wood's great. I should stop talking about them. The other 2 I want to mention, one is Shelter Point. They're on Vancouver Island. They They make largely single malt, and they make a lot with unmalted barley as well. Their stuff in the last couple of years as well has just boomed. Like, the quality is just really, really good. I judge the Canadian Whiskey Awards, or I have, for quite a few years, and they're kind of always up in my top 20. And they usually have multiple whiskeys that they're releasing, and just really, really nice, complex stuff that they do. And there's lots of single malts I could recommend, or barley whiskeys that I could recommend from them. So they're worth trying as well. There's a really interesting savory note to their barley whiskeys. They also do stuff like they make single malt wheat whiskeys, so it's not malted barley, it's malted wheat. They do field specific whiskey, so barley from a specific field, and so you can taste the impact of specific fields on the flavor of single malt. So really fun. And finally, definitely not least, is Two Brewers. This distillery is up in Yukon, and they make the best single malt in Canada. I'm pretty comfortable saying that. They waited a long time, but between when they started making whiskey to when they released it. They brand it really well. They release sort of a classic single malt. They have an innovative line which do things like they put some rye in some single malt. They do finishes, so like a sherry finish, and then they do peated whiskey as well. Almost everything they make is really good. And again, if I go back to my experience judging, Canadian Whiskey Awards and World Whiskey Awards and all this, when you smell their single malt, it's really remarkable. So it's good stuff. At the Victoria Whiskey Festival a number of years ago, Dave Broom and I were chatting, and he asked me what to try, and I said, "Oh, you gotta go try Two Brewers." And then we were having a drink a couple days later, and I asked him what his highlight was, and he said Two Brewers. Didn't even hesitate. So don't just believe my word. Dave Broom is someone certainly to listen to, yeah, worth listening to. So I'll taste some of them. I would say Shelter Point and Two Brewers, the quality of some of their stuff is enough to compete with the best whiskey that the big distilleries can make. So really, really remarkable. North of Seven sometimes is there too. There's been a few, the cast selections we've done. I have friends who put them in, who know a lot about Canadian whiskey, who put them among their top whiskeys, and I have friends who prefer some of their cast strength whiskeys to the antique collection, and they're from Buffalo Trace, which, if anyone knows bourbon, and those are nice whiskeys. So worth paying attention to for sure. So we'll jump into tasting in the next video.